The interview room smelled like fresh carpet glue and cold coffee, and Marissa Wren had exactly 11 minutes before her name got called. She checked her blazer in the reflection of a dark window. Secondhand, but pressed. She checked the resume in her folder for the fourth time, like the words might have changed. She had not eaten that morning. She had given the last of the eggs to a version of a life she no longer had access to 5 years ago. And she tried not to think about that, because thinking about that in a lobby, with cameras in the ceiling, was not going to get her a job. She needed this job. Not wanted. Needed. The way you need air when you've been underwater too long. The receptionist called her name. Marissa stood, smoothed her skirt, and walked toward a door with a brass plate that read simply DREZADRES. IR Operations. No name. Just a title. She didn't think much of it. Why would she? She had bigger things clawing at the inside of her chest than a name on a door. She sat down across the desk. She folded her hands. And then the door behind her opened, and a man walked in, and the air in the room changed before he even spoke. She knew that walk. She knew the set of those shoulders. She had watched that exact posture cross a hospital hallway once, 5 years ago, carrying a car seat with a baby in it, while she stood at the exit with a packed bag and a decision already made. Daniel Cole. Her husband. Her ex. Technically, though the paperwork had never quite caught up to the abandonment. The father of the son she had left in a bassinet 6 days old, screaming, while she told herself a story about needing to save herself in order to be worth anything to anyone else. He looked at her. He did not blink. He did not gasp. He simply closed the door behind him, walked to his side of the desk, and sat down, exactly the way he might sit down, across from anyone else applying for anything else. "Miss Wren," he said, reading off the folder, like her name was new to him. "Let's begin. If you've ever walked back into a room expecting an explosion and instead got silence, you already know how loud that silence can be. Stay with this one until the end. It does not go where you think it goes." 5 years earlier, Daniel Cole had not been the CEO of anything. He had been a mechanical systems engineer with grease permanently worked into the creases of his knuckles, living in a rented duplex 2 towns over from the hospital where his son was born. His wife left 10 days after the birth. Not during a fight, not after a slammed door. She left on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while he was at work, taking almost nothing, leaving a note that said she wasn't built for this and that he would be better at it without her getting in the way. He had read that note maybe 40 times that first week. He kept it in a drawer for a while. The way you keep an X-ray of a break, not because you want to look at it, but because some part of you needs proof that the injury was real. Then he stopped reading it. He put the baby, whose name was Theo, into a sling against his chest, and he went back to work 3 days later because rent didn't care about heartbreak. He was good at his job. Better than good. He had a mind built for systems, for the invisible architecture that makes machines and buildings and processes actually function. And more than that, he had a stubborn, immovable belief that things should be done correctly, even when nobody was watching. Especially when nobody was watching. That belief did not make him popular with everyone. It made him a problem for people who cut corners. But it made him indispensable to the people who mattered, and over 5 years, indispensable turned into promotions, and promotions turned into a buyout of a struggling firm, and the buyout turned into Cole Dynamics Group, a mid-size industrial and infrastructure company that Daniel now owned outright, having built it up from the wreckage of somebody else's failure, with the same patience he applied to everything. He raised Theo the entire time. Daycare in the early years. Then a nanny he vetted personally with the same rigor he applied to structural tolerances. Then, once he could afford it, a modest house with a workshop out back where he taught his son, now 5, how to sort bolts by thread size before the boy could properly tie his shoes. He did not talk about Marissa. Not to colleagues, not to friends, barely to himself. She existed in his life the way a bad weld exists in a structure. Something you inspected once, understood the failure of, and then reinforced around, so it could never compromise anything again. He had not expected to see her name on an applicant list. He had not expected, walking into that interview room, out of nothing more than a scheduling gap his assistant hadn't caught, to find her sitting there in a blazer that had seen better years, folder trembling almost imperceptibly in her hands. He had a decision to make in the 2 seconds between opening that door and sitting down, and he made it before he even sat. Not revenge. He did not believe in revenge. Revenge was emotional, and emotional was inefficient. And Daniel Cole did not build his life on inefficiency. What he decided on instead was something colder, something procedural. He would treat her exactly the way he treated every other applicant who walked through that door. No more, no less. Her file would move through the same process as anyone else's. Her competence, or lack of it, would be measured against the same rubric. If she was qualified, she would be hired. If she was not, she would not be, and the reason would have nothing to do with a note left in a drawer 5 years ago. It was the fairest thing he could do to her, and it was also, though he did not consciously frame it this way, the most devastating. Because Marissa had walked in, braced for a scene, she had rehearsed apologies in the elevator mirror. She had prepared herself for anger, for accusation, for the specific gravity of a man who had every right to throw her out of the building. Instead, she got a job interview. "Let's begin," Daniel said again, when she didn't answer the first time. His voice was level, not warm, not cruel. Level, the way a surface is level, the way something is level when it has been checked, with an actual tool and not just eyeballed. Marissa found her voice somewhere at the bottom of her throat. "Daniel, Miss Wren," he said, cutting across it, not sharply, just precisely the way you'd correct a measurement. "This is a professional interview for the position of logistics coordinator. If you'd prefer to withdraw your application, that's your right, and there will be no penalty attached to your file. If you'd like to proceed, we'll proceed on that basis. Which would you like to do?" She looked at him for a long moment. 5 years had put weight in his jaw that hadn't been there before, a kind of settled certainty in his eyes that she didn't recognize, because she had never seen him operate from a place of security. When she'd known him, he'd been anxious in the specific, twitchy way of a man trying to hold together a life with tape and overtime. This man across the desk did not look like he needed tape for anything. "I need this job," she said. It came out plain, not a plea, just a fact laid on the table between them. The only honest thing she had left to offer. "Then, let's proceed," Daniel said, and he opened her folder. He asked her about her last position, a warehouse inventory role she'd held for 11 months before the company downsized. He asked about a gap in her employment history, 18 months, and she told him without elaboration that she had been managing a family situation. And he wrote something down without looking up, and she understood distantly that he knew exactly what that gap was, because he had lived on the other side of it. He asked her about a specific logistics problem. A hypothetical scenario involving conflicting delivery schedules and a limited loading dock window, and she answered it well, better than well. She had, in fact, spent the last 3 years working her way up through smaller and smaller companies, learning the actual mechanics of supply chains out of sheer necessity, because a woman with a 5-year employment gap and no family safety net did not get to be picky about which skills she developed. Daniel listened to her answer with the same still attention he gave every candidate. He did not soften, he did not warm, but he also did not manufacture obstacles that weren't there. When her answer was good, he made a small mark in his notes that indicated it was good. When she stumbled on a technical detail about freight regulations, he noted that too, factually, without commentary. At the end of 11 minutes, he closed the folder. "And this. We'll be in touch within 5 business days," he said, and stood. And that was the entire interview. No confrontation, no accusation, no mention of a baby who had once screamed in a bassinet while she stood at an exit door. Marissa stood too, unsteady, and found herself saying the thing she had told herself she wouldn't say. "How is he?" Daniel's hand was on the door. He paused. "He's fine," he said 2 words. He did not elaborate. And something in the flatness of those 2 words told her more clearly than any speech could have that the door on that subject was closed, and that she had no key to it anymore, and that trying to force it would not go well for her. She left the building without knowing whether she'd gotten the job. She would spend the next 5 days in a state she hadn't felt in years, a specific, suffocating blend of hope and dread that made ordinary tasks, boiling water, folding laundry, feel like wading through wet sand. Daniel, for his part, did not spend those 5 days thinking about her at all, or so he told himself. He spent them the way he spent every week, which was methodically. His morning started at 5:30 with Theo, who was, at 5 years old, developing an alarming fascination with taking apart the toaster to understand why the springs made the bread pop up the way they did. Daniel let him. He believed, fundamentally, that understanding how things worked was the beginning of respecting them, and he wanted his son to grow up respecting the mechanics of the world rather than fearing them, or worse, ignoring them. "Why does it stop popping when the spring's bent?" Theo asked one morning, holding up the offending piece of metal with the serious concentration of a much older person examining evidence. "Because the spring's job is to store energy and release it all at once," Daniel said, crouching down to his level. "Bend it, and it can't store the energy right anymore. It's not broken. It's just been asked to do something it wasn't built for." Theo considered this with the gravity of a 5-year-old judge. "Can we fix it?" "We can try," Daniel said, and they did at the kitchen table. Before school, and this was the architecture of Daniel's actual life, the thing that mattered more than boardrooms or acquisitions or quarterly earnings. A boy who asked why. A father who had an answer, or was willing to find one. At the office, meanwhile, a different kind of mechanism was quietly grinding against itself, one Daniel had not yet noticed, because he trusted the people he placed in charge of day-to-day operations more than perhaps he should have. The man responsible for that particular blind spot was named Reginald Voss, Director of Regional Logistics, a title he wore like a medal he'd been given rather than one he'd earned. Voss had been with the company through its acquisition, inherited along with the previous ownership's staff, and he had spent the 2 years since carefully constructing a version of himself that looked from a distance exactly like competence. Up close, it was mostly performance. Voss was excellent at meetings. He was excellent at PowerPoint decks, with confident, forward-leaning language. He was excellent at identifying which numbers to present and which ones to bury in an appendix nobody read. What he was not excellent at, what he had in fact never really learned, was the actual work of logistics. The granular, unglamorous discipline of matching supply against demand, verifying vendor contracts, checking that the numbers on paper matched the trucks actually arriving at the actual docks. He had been getting away with the gap between appearance and substance for 2 years by delegating the real work downward and taking the credit upward. It was a functional strategy right up until the moment someone competent got close enough to see the seams. Marissa got the job. The email arrived on the 5th day, exactly as promised, offering her the position of logistics coordinator, reporting directly into Reginald Voss's division. She did not know when she accepted that she'd be working 2 floors and 1 org chart branch away from Daniel. She did not know that her first project would be a routine audit of shipment reconciliation reports, the kind of task junior enough to hand to a new hire, boring enough that nobody senior wanted to touch it. She threw herself into it the way she threw herself into everything now, because she had learned, in the wreckage of the life she'd walked out on, that competence was the only currency she had left that nobody could take from her by leaving a note on a table. It took her 9 days to find the first anomaly. It was small, a shipment reconciliation report for a client contract. Halstead Manufacturing showed delivery numbers that didn't match the actual dock logs by a margin of about 4%. 4% on its own might have been a rounding error, the kind of thing that happens with imperfect systems and human data entry. But when she cross-referenced 3 more months of the same contract, the 4% wasn't random. It moved in one direction only. Every month, the report showed slightly more product delivered than the actual logs recorded arriving. And every month, the invoice sent to Halstead Manufacturing matched the inflated number, not the real one. She sat with that for a long moment at her desk, the fluorescent light humming overhead, and did the thing she had trained herself to do instead of panicking. She checked it again. She pulled the raw dock data herself, timestamps and all, cross-checked driver logs, cross-checked warehouse sign-off sheets. She read the discrepancy a third time, then a fourth, the way you reread a diagnosis you don't want to be true, hoping the words will rearrange themselves into something survivable. They didn't. The numbers held. Someone was billing a client for product that had never actually shipped. She brought it properly through the correct channel, which meant a short meeting with her direct supervisor, Reginald Voss. Voss listened to her for exactly 90 seconds before his expression settled into something practiced and dismissive. "This happens," he said. "Reconciliation lag, documentation, timing differences between systems. It evens out over a quarter." "It doesn't even out," Marissa said. "It compounds. Every month it's higher than the last." "I've been doing this a long time, Miss Wren." He said her name the way you'd address a child who had wandered somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. "I appreciate the initiative. Genuinely. But you're new. And there's context here about how Halstead's contract is structured that you're not going to have visibility into yet. I'll take a look at it." He did not take a look at it. Marissa understood this within a week when she quietly pulled the following month's report and found the same pattern. Untouched, unflagged, still sailing through the pipeline exactly as it had before her audit. She had a decision to make. She could let it go, the way a person desperate to keep a job might reasonably choose to let it go. Or she could push, knowing that pushing against a director 2 levels above her in a company where she had been employed for less than a month, in the specific, precarious position of a woman with a 5-year gap on her resume and very few other doors currently open to her, was not a safe thing to do. She thought about Theo. Not because she had any right to, not because 5 years of absence earned her the sentimentality of thinking about a son she'd left behind, but because some part of her, watching numbers quietly steal money from a client, month after month, understood that this was exactly the kind of small, hidden rot that eventually breaks something much bigger. And somewhere in that thought was an image of a small boy inheriting a world built on rot. Like this, if nobody stopped it early, she flagged the discrepancy again. In writing this time, formally, with a timestamp, sent to Voss and copied per company protocol for financial irregularities exceeding a certain threshold, to the compliance inbox that fed, eventually, up toward the executive floor. Voss saw the copy line, and his jaw tightened in a way that, had Marissa been in the room to see it, would have told her everything she needed to know about how much danger she'd just put herself in. He came to her desk 2 days later, hovering with the specific false warmth of a man building a case. "You want to be careful how you escalate things here," he said. "This industry runs on relationships. You flag something like this without full context, and it looks less like diligence and more like you're trying to make noise to get noticed. People remember that." "I checked the numbers 4 times, Marissa said. "The context doesn't change the numbers," Voss smiled thin. "We'll see." Daniel found out about the discrepancy the way he found out about most things that actually mattered in his company, through the compliance inbox, which he personally reviewed every Friday afternoon, a habit most CEOs his size had long since delegated away, and one he refused to give up, because he had learned early that the gap between what a company reported and what a company actually did was where every disaster eventually lived. He read the flag. Marissa Wren, Halstead Manufacturing. 4% discrepancy compounding. He read it a second time, separating with some effort the name from the woman from the numbers on the page, forcing himself to evaluate the finding purely on its merits, the way he'd have evaluated it from anyone. The numbers were clean. The methodology was sound. Whoever had put this together had checked their work more than once. He pulled the historical file on the Halstead contract. He pulled Voss's sign-offs for the last 6 quarters. He found, sitting quietly in a place nobody had thought to look, because Voss had built his entire career on nobody looking, a pattern of small, consistent overbilling that had been running not for 4 months, but for closer to 14, across not 1 client but 3, totaling somewhere in the neighborhood of $200,000, in phantom deliveries billed to clients who had every right to eventually notice they'd been charged for product that never arrived. Daniel did not confront anyone. Immediately, that was not how he worked. He believed with the same conviction he applied to structural loads and torque specifications, that you did not act on a hypothesis until you had verified it against reality. as many times as it took to be certain, because acting on an unverified hypothesis was how buildings fell down and companies got sued and people got hurt. So, he did what he always did. He verified. He requested the raw shipment data directly from the warehouse logs, bypassing the reporting layer entirely. He cross-referenced it against invoices sent to all 3 clients Voss's division managed. He built the picture slowly, the way he built everything, one confirmed data point at a time, refusing to let urgency compress a process that needed to be airtight. It took him 10 days. At the end of those 10 days, he had a complete, unimpeachable account of exactly what Reginald Voss had been doing, and exactly how long he'd been doing it, and exactly how much money had quietly walked out the back door of Coal Dynamics Group, while Voss stood in the front lobby, giving confident presentations about quarterly growth. He also had sitting uncomfortably at the center of that account the name of the person who had actually found it. Not compliance. Not an auditor. Not anyone on his executive team whose job it technically was to catch exactly this kind of thing. Marissa. He sat with that for longer than he wanted to admit. It complicated something he had, until that point, kept carefully simple. He had built a version of her in his head over 5 years. Necessarily flattened, necessarily one-dimensional, because the alternative, thinking of her as a full person, capable of both abandoning a newborn and also being sharp enough to catch a fraud that his own compliance department had missed for over a year, was harder to hold. He did not resolve that complication that week. He filed it, the way he filed most things he wasn't ready to act on, and he focused instead on the part of the problem that was actually urgent. Voss was still in his position, still had access, and now had a strong motive to bury the person who'd found him out. Voss moved first, exactly as Daniel had suspected he might. 2 days after Marissa's second formal flag, a new report appeared in the compliance system, this one authored by Voss himself, alleging that Marissa Wren, a recently hired coordinator with limited institutional knowledge, had improperly accessed shipment data outside her authorization scope and had misrepresented reconciliation figures in an apparent attempt to manufacture a controversy, possibly, the report suggested delicately, as a way to draw attention to herself early in her tenure. It was a well-constructed lie. Voss had learned, over 2 years of surviving on performance rather than substance, exactly how to build a paper trail that looked plausible to anyone who didn't check it against the underlying reality. He'd altered 2 access logs. He'd attached a memo backdated suggesting he'd already flagged concerns about Marissa's judgment during her onboarding. He built, in essence, a small, tidy frame, and he presented it upward with the same smooth confidence he used for everything. He recommended her termination, effective immediately, citing data misuse and a breach of the company's information access policy, and he sent that recommendation directly to Human Resources. And, because company protocol required it for any termination involving compliance flag material, to Daniel. Marissa found out on a Tuesday morning, called into a small conference room with a Human Resources representative she'd never met, and a printed letter already sitting on the table, face down, like a card someone had already decided to play. "We've received a formal report regarding unauthorized data access," the representative said, not unkindly, but with the flat, procedural tone of someone reading from a script they didn't write and didn't fully understand. "Given the compliance concerns, we're placing you on immediate suspension pending review. This isn't necessarily permanent, but you'll need to surrender your badge and company laptop today." Marissa sat very still. She had lived enough of her life absorbing bad news, standing up, learning too late that it knocked you down harder that way, so she had trained herself over the years to receive it seated, spine straight, hands flat on whatever surface was in front of her. "I found a discrepancy," she said. "I reported it correctly through the proper channel. Twice." "I understand there's a dispute about the sequence of events," the representative said. "That's part of what the review will look at. I did not access anything outside my role. I pulled doc logs that were within my project scope for the audit I was assigned." "I hear you," the representative said, which was the kind of sentence people said specifically when they intended to do nothing about what they'd heard. Marissa left the building that afternoon with a small cardboard box of desk items and a suspension letter she'd read 3 times in the elevator, hoping the words would say something different on the 4th pass. They didn't. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before she could make herself start the engine, running the math on her savings account, on rent, on the specific arithmetic of what happens to a person with almost no safety net when the one door that had opened for her slammed shut again, this time with her fingers still in the frame. She thought, briefly, bitterly, that she should have known, that rooms with Daniel's name attached to them, even distantly, even 2 org cart branches away, were never going to be safe for her, no matter how carefully she tried to earn her way through them on merit alone. She was wrong about that, though she wouldn't find out how wrong for another 4 days. Daniel received Voss's termination recommendation the same afternoon it was filed, and something in him, something he did not examine too closely in the moment, refused to simply sign off on it the way he might have signed off on a routine matter. Not because it was Marissa. He told himself that. And it was partly true. It was also because the recommendation, read carefully, had the specific texture of every fabricated report he'd ever caught in his career. Too clean, too convenient, arriving suspiciously fast after the person it targeted had made herself inconvenient to someone else. He did not sign it, he held it. Instead, he called his systems administrator and requested the full, unedited access logs for the compliance database, going back 60 days, along with metadata on when each entry had been created and modified. Not the summary Voss had submitted, the raw underlying data. It took his administrator, a quiet, thorough woman named Priya Anand, who had been with the company since its earliest days and who Daniel trusted the way he trusted very few people, about 6 hours to pull everything and lay it out cleanly. The picture that emerged was not complicated once you had the real data in front of you. Marissa's access to the doc logs had occurred squarely within her assigned audit window, using credentials scoped exactly the way they should have been for her role. The memo Voss claimed he'd written during her onboarding, flagging concerns about her judgment, had a creation timestamp 2 days after her second formal flag, not weeks before it, as the printed version implied. He'd backdated a document and hadn't realized the system still logged the true creation time underneath the cosmetic date field. It was, Daniel thought, looking at it, a mistake born of exactly the kind of overconfidence that eventually took down every version of this particular type of person he'd ever encountered. Voss had spent 2 years getting away with small dishonesties because nobody senior had bothered to check the underlying data. He had assumed, reasonably enough, given his track record, that nobody would check this time either. Daniel checked. He always checked. He sat with the full picture for a night, the way he sat with everything, and the next morning, instead of going to his office, he drove to the address on file for Marissa Wren. It was a small apartment above a laundromat, the kind of place chosen for its price rather than its charm. And when she opened the door and saw him standing there, her face did something complicated, a mixture of dread and confusion that she didn't bother to hide, because she no longer had the energy to perform composure for a man who had already seen the worst version of her decisions. "I have some questions," Daniel said, "about the audit." "I already lost the job," she said. "You don't have to do this in person." "I'm not here about the suspension," he said. "I'm here because I read the full data trail last night, and I want to hear directly from you how you found the Halstead discrepancy. Not the summary, the actual process." She stared at him for a moment, then stepped back and let him in. Mostly, he suspected later, because she was too tired to do anything else. The apartment was small and orderly in a way that told him something he hadn't expected to notice. Bare, but not neglected. Everything in its place. A single framed photograph on a shelf. One he recognized with a small jolt, an old picture of the 3 of them from the hospital. The one thing, apparently, she had kept. He didn't comment on it. He sat down at her small kitchen table when she gestured to it, and he asked her, methodically, the way he'd have interviewed any engineer explaining a diagnostic process, to walk him through exactly what she checked, in what order, and why. She did. She pulled up her own notes on her personal laptop, time-stamped, thorough, a record that matched, almost exactly, the underlying data Priya had pulled the night before. 4 checks. 4 independent confirmations before she'd ever escalated it. The same rigor, Daniel thought, that he applied to his own work, arrived at independently, by someone he had once assumed incapable of that kind of discipline in anything. Voss backdated a memo, Daniel said, when she'd finished. The system logged the real creation date underneath it. He wrote it 2 days after your second escalation, not before it. It's not close. It's not deniable. Marissa's hands resting on the table went very still. So he made it up. He made it up, Daniel confirmed. The whole complaint against you is fabricated to cover a fraud that's been running 14 months and cost the company somewhere around $200,000. You found it. Compliance didn't. My own audit team didn't. You did, in your first month, on an assignment nobody senior wanted to do. She didn't say anything to that. She looked for a moment, like she didn't quite know where to put the information. The way people look when they've spent so long expecting the worst outcome that a good one doesn't have a slot to land in yet. I'm reinstating you effective immediately, Daniel said. There'll be a formal meeting. You'll be there. Voss will be there. It's going to be uncomfortable. And it's going to be public, because that's the only way this kind of thing actually gets fixed instead of quietly reshuffled. I need you to be ready for that. Why? Marissa asked, and it wasn't about the reinstatement. They both understood that. Daniel considered the question honestly before answering it, which was in itself unlike the version of confrontation she'd braced herself for back in that first interview. Because the numbers were right, he said. And because punishing the person who found the truth in order to protect the person who hid it isn't something I'm willing to run a company on. That's not about you and me. That's just the only way I know how to do this. It was not forgiveness. It was not, she understood, anything close to reconciliation. It was, instead, exactly what he'd offered her in that first interview. The same standard applied evenly, regardless of history, regardless of the note she'd left in a drawer 5 years ago, that he had apparently never quite thrown away either, if the photograph on her own shelf was any indication of how neither of them had fully closed that door. The meeting happened 3 days later in the largest conference room on the executive floor, with every director in Voss's chain of command present, along with 2 members of the board, because Daniel had learned that problem solved quietly tended to recur, while problem solved in daylight tended to actually change behavior. Voss walked in with his usual practiced ease, a folder under his arm, already several sentences into a mental speech about institutional knowledge and the risks of junior staff overstepping their scope. He had not been told the specific purpose of the meeting, only that it concerned the Halstead account, and he assumed, reasonably enough given how the last 10 years of his career had gone, that assumption would once again carry him through. I want to start by saying I take data integrity extremely seriously, Voss began. Once everyone was seated, addressing the room with the smooth, forward-leaning confidence of a man who had given some version of this speech many times before. The situation with Miss Wren's audit raised some concerns for me about scope creep in junior roles, and I think it's worth discussing process improvements, so we don't. I'd like to see the memo you referenced in your termination recommendation, Daniel said. The one about onboarding concerns. Voss produced it, sliding it across the table with the easy confidence of a man who'd checked his own work exactly 0 times, because checking his own work had never once been necessary before. Daniel didn't look at the printed page. He turned his laptop instead, angling the screen so the room could see it, and pulled up the system metadata Priya had extracted 2 nights earlier. This document, Daniel said, has a printed date of 6 weeks ago. Its actual creation timestamp, recorded by the system itself, independent of any date field a person can edit, is 2 days after Miss Wren's second formal compliance flag on the Halstead discrepancy. The room went quiet, in the specific way rooms go quiet when something shifts underneath everyone's feet at once. That's a system error, Voss said too quickly. Metadata can be unreliable. There's been issues with I had our administrator pull the raw audit logs on that database going back a year. Daniel continued, evenly laying a second document on the table. There have been no metadata errors logged on that system in 14 months. What there has been over that same period is a sustained discrepancy between shipped product and billed product on 3 client accounts under your direct management totaling approximately $211,000 in phantom deliveries. He laid out the reconciliation data next to it. Then the invoice history. Then, quietly, the original audit Marissa had submitted, side by side with his own independent verification, showing them to be identical in substance, arrived at through entirely separate paths. Miss Wren found this in her first month on a routine assignment, Daniel said. She flagged it correctly twice, through the proper channel. When that became inconvenient, a fabricated complaint was filed against her using a backdated document, in an apparent attempt to have her terminated before the underlying fraud could be traced back to its source. Voss's face had gone through several colors in the span of that sentence. "This is a mischaracterization," he said, and his voice had lost some of its smoothness now, the polish cracking at the edges. "I've been with this company for 6 years. I built the client relationships on those accounts personally. You're going to take the word of someone who was hired a month ago over I'm not taking anyone's word," Daniel said. "I'm reading a timestamp that can't be edited by the person it implicates. That's the entire point of the system. It doesn't care how long you've been here." He let that sit in the room for a moment, before continuing. "Effective today, you're suspended pending a full financial review, which will be conducted by outside counsel, not internally, given the scope of what's been found. Depending on what that review turns up, this may move beyond an employment matter. Security will escort you to collect personal items. Your access to all company systems has already been revoked as of 9 this morning." Voss looked for a moment like he might argue further, might reach for one more layer of confident, plausible-sounding language to paper over what had just happened in front of 2 board members and every director in his chain of command. But there was nothing left to reach for. The numbers didn't care about his tone. The timestamp didn't care about his tenure. He stood, gathered nothing, because there was nothing on the table that belonged to him anymore, and walked out under the escort of a security officer who had been quietly waiting by the door the entire meeting, which told Marissa, watching from her seat near the end of the table, that Daniel had known exactly how this was going to end before it started. He always checked. He never acted until he was certain. And once he was certain, he did not hesitate. The board in the weeks that followed did not simply let the matter close with Voss's departure. One of the 2 directors present that day, a woman named Eleanor Price, who had been on the board since the company's earliest incarnation, decades before Daniel's acquisition, insisted on a broader review of how compliance flags had been handled historically. And it was in that review that a pattern emerged, showing Marissa's case was not the first time a junior employee's legitimate concern had been buried by someone protecting their own position. It was simply the first time anyone senior had bothered to check the underlying data instead of trusting the summary. Eleanor, who remembered the company's founder personally, a man who had built the original firm on a simple, unglamorous principle that the numbers tell the truth even when people don't, made it a point to sit with Daniel privately afterward. "He'd have liked this," she said, meaning the founder, meaning the outcome. "He used to say the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the least to actually show you. You didn't inherit that instinct. You built it yourself. That matters more." Daniel didn't say much in response. He rarely did. When a compliment landed somewhere he hadn't prepared a rebuttal for, he simply nodded and filed it away, the way he filed most things that mattered. Marissa was formally reinstated with back pay for the suspension period and a note in her file that stripped out every trace of Voss's fabricated complaint, replaced instead with a formal commendation for the Halstead discovery, the kind of document that actually meant something, on a resume. Done like the note that had once sat in Daniel's kitchen drawer, meaning nothing to anyone but him. She was offered, 3 weeks later, a promotion not by Daniel directly, but through the proper channel, a newly created position overseeing compliance, verification across all regional accounts, a role built specifically because the review had shown the company needed someone whose entire job was to check the underlying data nobody else bothered to check. It was, in effect, exactly the role she had stumbled into by accident with the Halstead audit, now made permanent and given real authority. She took it, not because it solved anything between her and Daniel, which It didn't, not fully, not quickly, but because it was, for the first time in 5 years, an offer built entirely on what she had actually done, with no shadow of the past attached to it. And she had learned enough, by now, to recognize the difference between an opportunity and a trap, and to take the opportunity without waiting for permission to feel like she deserved it. Daniel did not offer her any relationship beyond the professional one, not in those weeks, not for a while after. He was not a man who rushed toward resolution simply because a resolution was available. He had built his entire adult life on verifying things slowly, on refusing to trust a summary when the underlying data was still incomplete, and whatever remained unresolved between himself and the woman who had once left a note in a drawer was not something he was willing to shortcut just because the story around it had a tidy shape now. But he also did not close the door the way he might have 3 months earlier before he'd sat across from her at a small kitchen table and watched her lay out, methodically without a single wasted word, exactly how she'd found a truth that had been sitting in plain sight for 14 months while everyone senior to her had simply chosen not to look. It was Theo in the end who moved things forward in the unthinking, direct way that 5-year-olds move things forward without any awareness of the careful architecture the adults around him were trying to maintain. Daniel had brought him to the office one Saturday, an old habit from before the company had grown large enough to have actual policies about children in the building, and Theo had wandered, as he always did, toward whichever desk had the most interesting-looking objects on it, which happened, that particular Saturday, to be Marissa's, where a small disassembled shipment scanner sat in pieces, something she'd been troubleshooting the day before out of pure curiosity about how the tracking mechanism worked. "What's this do?" Theo asked her, without any preamble, holding up a small circuit board like it was the most natural question in the world to ask a stranger. Marissa knelt down to his level, the way she'd apparently learned to do with children she worked around, though she'd had no practice doing it with this particular one, and explained, simply, how the scanner read a barcode and matched it against a database to confirm a package had actually arrived where it was supposed to. Theo listened with the same serious concentration he gave the toaster at home. "Is it broken?" "A little," Marissa said. "I'm trying to figure out why." "My dad says things aren't broken," Theo informed her, with the confident authority of someone repeating scripture. "They're just being asked to do something they weren't built for." Marissa went very still for a moment and did not, to her credit, let her voice do anything complicated in front of the boy. "That sounds about right," he said quietly. Daniel, watching from a few feet away, did not say anything either. But something in his chest loosened slightly, watching the two of them crouched over a broken circuit board, his son explaining his own philosophy, back to a woman who was, whether either of them had fully said it aloud yet, slowly becoming something more than a name on a compliance report. He did not rush it after that. But he stopped, quietly treating the door as fully closed. 6 months after the Halstead review concluded, Daniel sat in his office on a quiet Thursday evening, the building mostly emptied out, and reviewed the quarter's compliance summary with the same unhurried attention he gave everything. Marissa's new division had, in that time, caught 2 smaller discrepancies. Before they became anything close to what Voss had built, both handled cleanly, both resolved through proper channels, without drama, without fabricated memos, without anyone needing to be escorted out by security. The company was by every measure that actually mattered to him, healthier than it had been in years. Not because of one dramatic confrontation in a conference room, though that had certainly mattered, but because the culture underneath it had shifted slowly, the way water eventually reshapes stone, not through force, but through persistence, until the people inside the building understood that the numbers would always be checked, that the truth would always eventually surface, and that the only reliable long-term strategy was simply to be honest in the first place. Marissa knocked on his open door around 6, a habit she'd developed over the months, checking in before she left for the day, not because it was required, but because it had become, without either of them quite naming it, something they both looked forward to. "Theo wants to know if the toaster's fixable," she said, holding up her phone with a photo he'd apparently sent to her through Daniel's own device, a small act of a boy who had simply decided, without asking anyone's permission, that she belonged in that particular chain of communication now. "It's fixable," Daniel said. Everything usually is if you're willing to actually look at it instead of guessing. Marissa smiled, small, real, and sat down across from him, not in the stiff, careful posture of that first interview 5 months earlier, but the way a person sits down when they've finally stopped waiting for the room to turn against them. "I never got to say it properly," she said. "I'm sorry for what I did, not because you're my boss, because it was wrong, and I know sorry doesn't undo it." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, the same level, unhurried attention he gave every problem worth solving carefully. "I know," he said. "I'm not looking for an apology to fix it. I think we're past needing it fixed all at once. I think it's more like the toaster. You don't repair 5 years in one sitting. You just keep showing up and doing the next honest thing, and eventually it adds up to something that works again." Outside, the city had gone quiet in the particular way it did on Thursday evenings, and somewhere across town, a small boy was waiting for his father to come home and take apart a broken machine with him, not because it needed to be fixed that night, but because understanding how something worked was, in this family, always going to matter more than pretending it had never been broken at all. Marissa stood, eventually gathered her things, and paused at the door. "Same time tomorrow," she said. "Not a question." "Same time," Daniel confirmed, and turned back to his monitor. And the building settled into its evening quiet, 2 floors above a compliance department that no longer needed watching quite so closely, because the people running it had learned the hard way that the truth, checked carefully enough, checked enough times, always eventually held.